Let's take a look at how we can add some basic CSS to this simple web page. Here I have an HTML page and I'm using a variety of headings, paragraphs, and lists. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll give some more space to the CSS pane in CodePen. Remember that CodePen is divided up into 3 panes where you can add HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I generally only have the panes active that I need to be working on. In order to use CSS, you'll need to choose which specific parts of the HTML you want to style. For example, let's start off by styling our H1. In order to style the H1 element, I'm going to need to select that element. So we'll type the name of the selector, and then we're going to go ahead and open our curly braces. The curly braces are going to contain the declarations. The declarations are the property value pairs that describe what we want to have happen to that particular selector. If I want to change the color of the selector, I'll use the color property followed by a colon, and then I'll add the value for that particular property. As soon as I do that, you can see that this particular element is now going to update and display in that particular manner. If you want to go ahead and control multiple properties, you simply are going to make another line, add the next property. So here we'll add a property for border bottom. I'm going to make this solid 3 pixels, and we'll also make this teal. Every time you end a declaration, you need to go ahead and terminate it by adding a semicolon. You can add as many declarations as you want to within your CSS rule. Now that I have this formulated, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another rule. This time, I want the rule to control everything on the page. If I want to control everything on the page, I'm going to use the selector for body. And it doesn't really matter in which order that you put your CSS selectors, but I like to keep things organized, so I generally work from the top down. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a property for font family. Then we'll specify that the font family is Verdana, and generally when we declare font families, we usually create something called a font stack. A font stack allows us to make a first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. In this case, I'm simply going to select Verdana as my first choice, and then I'm going to select sans serif as the fallback choice. As you can see, everything on my page has now updated with this particular declaration. Now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and let's modify our page in a different way. What I want to do next is I want these 3 lines of my page to be styled a little bit differently from everything else on the page. We're going to go ahead and we are going to make this area of the page one single unit. Now, if we reference our HTML, these 3 elements are 3 separate HTML elements. When we talk about HTML, you can think of every element existing inside a container or inside a box. So the H1 is a box, the paragraph is a box, and the next paragraph is also a box. In order for me to be able to style these 3 elements together, I need to be able to put them in their own box. Let's do that next. In order for us to be able to target these 3 elements, we need to place them in a container so that we can grab that container. In order to do this, I'm going to add a new HTML element to my page. I'm going to be using a div. Div elements are division elements in HTML, and they are what we call null elements. This means that by themselves, they do not change anything or provide any formatting to the elements on the page. The reason that we use divs is so that we have a way to hook something on our page and be able to style it in a particular way. Now that I have my div in place, I can use this as a hook for my HTML. I'm going to come down into the CSS pane, and I'm actually going to remove the border that we added to the H1. What we're going to do now is we're going to add a new rule for the div element. So I'm going to target div. This time I'm going to add a background color. When we specify values for colors, we can use keyword colors like I have here, or you can use something called a hex value. A hex value is a numeric representation of a particular color. Hex values always start with the hash symbol, and they generally contain 6 letters and/or characters. I want to make the background of my div a very light teal, so I'm going to plug in the hex value of CFF4EF. Now that I've done that, you can see that the background of this area is going to change to teal. In addition to changing the background color, I'm going to also add a border on the bottom of this particular element. I'll also go ahead and I'll use text align center to center the text in the middle of this particular element. As you can see, all of the elements are going to update based on the styles that I've provided. The other thing that I want to do is I want a little bit more space between the top of the teal box and the text. In order to do that, I'm going to use something called padding. Remember that earlier I mentioned that in HTML, everything exists within a box. Well, the boxes have something called padding associated with them. Padding is the spacing on the inside of the box. So when I add 10 pixels of padding, it's going to add padding around all 4 edges of the box, and the spacing is going to exist in the inside of the box. We also have a way that we can control the spacing on the outside of the box. You'll notice that this link is very close to the box that we just made, the div. If I want to space out this link from this particular div, I need to add something called margin. And for this particular example, I'm going to specify margin-bottom to only target the margin on the bottom of the div. Then I'll go ahead and I'll add a value so that the spacing is going to be added in on the outside of our div. In this way, I can control a lot of various attributes about the elements that are on my page. Now, before we move on, I did want to point out that currently I'm using a selector of div. At present, I only have one div on my page, but let's say I add another div to the page. I'm going to add a div around my description list. So I'm going to go into my HTML, and right before my H2 for my description list, I'm going to add a div. I'll go ahead and I'll close this div after the description list. I like to always indent elements that are descendants or children of the parent element. So I'm going to select all of these elements right here, and I'm going to hit tab just to indent them. This is just a visual way that I can clearly define which elements are descendants or children of the parent elements. As you can see, this div now updates with the exact same styling. It is common that you may not want all of the divs or all of a particular selector to appear in the exact same way. When we have multiple items on our page and we want to go ahead and target them uniquely, we need to have a way to identify those particular items. We do that by adding an attribute to that particular element and assign a unique identifier to that particular element. In order to do this, we can go ahead and assign an ID or a class. For right now, I'm going to assign an ID, and I'm going to give this ID a value of header. It is worth mentioning that when you use any ID and assign a particular value, That value can only be used once on this particular web page. So it would not be valid for me to create any other element on the page and give it an ID with header. I could certainly use an ID and give it another value, but I couldn't use the value of header. Now that I have a unique identifier assigned to this div, I can go back into my CSS and I can now be more specific. So instead of simply writing div, I can write div hash, and then I'm going to write header. Whenever we want to target an ID, we use the hash symbol followed by the value name for the ID. This allows us to specify that this is an ID name. In this instance, I'm also specifying that we have to be looking for a div with an ID of header. In this case, I could also simply just write header and it would do the exact same thing. I don't necessarily need the div, but either way is going to go ahead and update my page and display it in this particular way. The last thing that I want to show you right now is how we can use class values. So we talked about IDs. Classes are very similar to IDs. They allow us to assign a unique identifier to any element on the page. The difference is going to be that classes can be used multiple times. That same value can be used multiple times. So I'm going to come down into my page and I'm going to select one of my list items and I'll go ahead and add a class, and we're just going to call this special. As you can see, this doesn't do anything to the element on the page, but now I have a way to hook or grab this particular element. In addition to assigning the class of special to this list item, I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to assign the same class value to this H2. So I'll go ahead and write class equals, and then we'll write special for the value. Because this is a class, I can use the value multiple times on my page. We'll go ahead and we'll make one other list item have the class of special. As you can see, by itself, the classes don't do anything. But now that I have these in place, I can use CSS to target or change these items on the page. When we want to select something with a class name, we preface the class name by a period. So I'm going to write dot special or period special. I'll open the curly braces and let's go ahead and let's just change the color. I'm going to go ahead and specify that the color is dark red. As you can see, all of the items that have the class of special now appear as dark red. Currently, I'm using a very generic selector of just dot special. This is grabbing list items and the H2. Let me show you what happens if we add a more specific selector to this particular rule. If I changed this to say H2 dot special, you will see that now only the H2 is going to be red. The list items are no longer going to be styled in that way, even though they contain the class value of special. This is an example of specificity. In CSS, when we are more specific, we can uniquely target or control various elements on the page. So if I wanted any item on my page to be dark red, if it has a class of special, I need to get rid of the beginning part of the selector and just use the more generic selector of dot special. When I go ahead and add the selector element before the class name, then I'm adding more specificity to the selector. As you can see, once you understand the basics of CSS, it's pretty straightforward in how we can apply these sorts of formatting to the page. CSS has a lot of ways in which we can control elements on the page. This just is the tip of the iceberg. we pretty much are just doing some basic text formatting on our page. As you learn more about CSS and HTML, you'll learn that there are all sorts of ways to control the layout of the page and pretty much any sort of design-based attribute of the web page. CSS really opens a lot of doors, allowing you to style the page in a plethora of different ways.